Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. My name is Quincy Gary, and I want to welcome you guys to the Hugo Olijveld Huis. This is a really special location. It's been in the hands of the organization, the Association Ons Suriname, Vereniging Ons Suriname, and for the last 40 years, and the last 20 years they've owned it. And the organization itself, the Association Vereniging Ons Suriname, has existed since 1919. So this year we're celebrating our 96th anniversary. And I think that's really special. Because I think what we're going to talk about tonight, from protest to policy, is exactly what's embedded in the DNA of this location, of the association. How do you make a protest lasting? How do you make the change that you want? How do you make them durable? How do you make sure that it goes beyond the flash in the pan moment? And I think tonight we've gathered a couple of really interesting guests to talk about it. I want to point you guys to the screen because there their names are and their respective organizations. So we have Adam Elliott Cooper. He's from Great Britain, and he just told me he went to South Africa a couple of weeks ago.
I did.
And what's interesting is that you see that all of us are connected in some way with the protests that are going on all over the world. So Adam Elliott Cooper, give him a round of applause. We have Dereka Purnell. She's a Harvard Law student, and she's also part of the Black Lives Matter movement. And she also knows someone who Adam knows in South Africa. And he found out tonight. So that's pretty cool to know as well, right? All of the crisscrosses and things that come together. So give a round of applause for Derek. And we also have now Ford, also from the US, and he is also going to talk about a little bit his own projects and what exactly we're going to have, what exactly we can move forward towards. And what's interesting is that we've asked Adam, Dereka, and Nao to speak about their own context, and Adam is going to do it from the Great Britain perspective, and Dereka and Nao are going to do a collaboration dialogue kind of thing. So as you see, as we set up the program, they break it and they protest against it. Thank you. And we also have Mitchell Esaias from New Urban Collective. He's also going to talk from the Dutch perspective what exactly we're doing here to move beyond from protest to policy. The breakdown of tonight is going to be, they're going to talk a bit more from the context, then I'm going to interview them, kind of collaborative discussion, what exactly those contexts have in common or don't, and if we agree on the end game of policy or not, because I think that came up before as well. Some of us don't agree. I think that's good. And after that, we're going to have a short break, and after the break, we're going to have audience participation. So if you have questions, make sure write them down, and then after the break, you can just fire them all on us. Right? Yeah, I love that. We're in the firing range. The first person I'm going to call to the stage is Adam, and Adam is going to talk about the perspective from Great Britain. Give a round of applause for Adam.
Hi everyone. So from protest to policy, it's an interesting title. I've worked in policy a little bit in the UK, race equality policy. I've also been involved in protest in the UK, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience of both of them, I guess. I guess in relation to policy, I guess I should begin by saying that policy can be something really positive. Right? Policy is really important for, I guess, the everyday survival of people who are marginalised by capitalism or white domination or colonisation and what have you. And we can see loads of really positive examples of policy initiatives being brought forward by grassroots movements, by protests. Right? So we can think about whether it be in the US with the Black Panthers having a free breakfast programme which pushed for breakfast to now be provided by the state in the US. Or the fact that in Britain there were massive strikes in the 1960s and 70s, which led to policy which meant that women had to get equal pay to men. So we can see that protests can lead to policy in important ways. But I think there's a problem, and I think that's to do with the fact that despite many of these protests leading to progressive reforms, you know, the fact that the Equal Pay Act in the UK and of state provision in the US and what have you, they don't necessarily address the fundamental inequalities that plague our societies. And so if we think about, for instance, the way in which the law is constructed and legislation is constructed, I think very fundamentally there are quite fundamental inequalities. So if we think about the fact that if a black person is suspected of handling a weapon in somewhere like Europe or the US, it's likely they'll be criminalised quite quickly. However, if an arms manufacturer sells F-16s to Saudi Arabia or cluster bombs to Israel, they're considered to be a pillar of industry, right? So although they're comparable acts, one is criminalised and one is considered quite honourable within our society. And similarly, if a middle-class person wants to travel the world, they're considered open-minded. But if refugees want to cross our borders, their very presence is considered a criminalised act. And similarly, political lobbying shapes our so-called democracies here in the West. But begging in places like Britain is a criminalised act on our streets. And so what we see here is, on a very fundamental level, rather than the crime and the law relating to any kind of moral obligation, what they really focus on and what they really point to is the criminalisation of poverty and the criminalisation of black life. And so perhaps as a way of thinking beyond reform, from protest through policy into something else, we can think about the kinds of protests that we see taking place in various parts of the world. A lot of the anti-police activism that we've been seeing in the United States, the Black Lives Matter movement, Hands Up, Don't Shoot, and what have you, have been shutting down major shopping districts and have been really, really disruptive in the functioning of US society. And many of their demands have not been for police reform necessarily, but for community control of the police. Similarly, as has already mentioned, we've seen students in South Africa shutting down entire educational institutions. University of Cape Town, Wits University in Johannesburg, Rhodes University, or the university currently called Rhodes, in Grahamstown in South Africa, have all been completely shut down. Lectures have stopped, and these institutions can no longer function. And these demands aren't simply for a better education, they're for the decolonisation of South Africa, including its spaces of knowledge production. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was involved in a protest in King's Cross Station in London, where the Eurotunnel emerges, right? This is the tunnel that connects Britain and France. And this entire protest shut down the Eurotunnel. So it stopped bourgeois people having a weekend away in Paris. And what this did, one of the reasons this protest was organised, was to show the fact that people are trying to cross these borders because their lives depend on them, because they're fleeing wars and conflicts of which Europeans are often very much implicated, and they cannot, and they die as a result. And so by blocking these borders, again, it was disrupting these spaces of transit and making real demands on the state not to have quotas for refugees, but to open borders completely and not make any human being an illegal. And so I think that in making the radical demands that really fundamentally challenge the way we conceptualise legislation, the law, or policy, we can really fundamentally try to dismantle the inequalities which mark the systems in which we live and move towards something far better. And I'll leave it there.
Lots of food for thought. And now I'm going to call Dereka and Now to have their dialogue. Give them a round of applause.
Okay, maybe it's not going to be a complete dialogue. We interrupt each other a lot, so it may turn into a dialogue. I just want to just share a quick story. So in the United States, you know, there have been a lot of movements for Black life. A lot of these movements have led to policy that has caused protests in the United States. So when we talk about policy as a solution, as a response, I also want to talk about policy as a way that we've seen in the United States to spark protest. So when I was 16 or 17 years old, I was in high school, and the country was going through an affirmative action debate. So affirmative action was a government program / policy to help diversify colleges, universities, workplace employment, government contracts, etc. In California, there were a group of people who lobbied for a change in policy, and they called it the California Civil Rights Initiative. So when we hear civil rights, we hear, oh man, like Martin Luther King, people gonna get free. Like that's what civil rights sounds like. That's what it feels. Like. But the civil rights policy that was being lobbied for in California was actually an attack on affirmative action. So the policy basically said that no one will be given preferential treatment due to their historical background, race, color, etc. Which sounds like they're trying to minimize inequality, but the way that the policy was worded actually dismantled affirmative action in the state of California, still to this day. So we're 8 years into this affirmative action ban in California. We see that diversity in law schools, colleges, and employment have dropped drastically, so much to the point where public universities have to rely on private sector solutions in order to achieve some sort of diversity in their classrooms, in their places of employment. So when I was 17 years old, one of my good friends, Evan, this is a shout out. One of my good friends, Evan, a shout out is when you publicly acknowledge one of your friends. It's like you call it. Oh, okay, sorry. So a shout out. Evan said, hey, you know, this initiative that was on the ballot in California, someone's trying to bring it to Missouri and it's really racist. And I was like, racism? Like, what are you talking about? Like, no one's racist anymore, let alone trying to pass some policy that would have this sort of racial impact on people. So he sort of like sat me down. I was like, no, chill. Like, people are still racist. Like, ask me questions and learn about why. So after having, a couple of discussions, he eventually convinced me to organize against this ballot initiative in Missouri. And that was my first introduction to organizing. And it was actually anti-policy. So one thing that I know that I feel a lot of pressure coming from this movement, people are asking for demands. Like, we need demands, we need policy, we need law changes. And as a law student, I completely agree with that. We do need policy. We do need the laws to change. But we can't have so much pressure on calling for those things that we're not thinking critically about how people are going to do them right and effectively. We can't be so eager to develop a response to all of the brutality we see, all of the anti-blackness that we see that's manifested in police brutality, in education, in healthcare. We can't be so eager to respond to a critique of the movement that we lack what it takes to develop effective and efficient social policy to actually help people progress. Because when I look at California, and I think about how many people are not going to have the opportunity to attend college, that's backwards public policy. So we have to be mindful of what we are calling public policy. We need to be mindful of the type of public policy that we want to create that may ultimately lead to more protests, and it has to be a back and forth. The terms policy and protest must be a continuous debate as we think about what we want to come out of this movement, and it has to keep going forward.
Yeah, where everything she said, for real though. So I won't speak long. I come to this conversation as an organizer. I come to the conversation as a minister. I come to the conversation as a first-year PhD student who's trying to figure some of these things out. So maybe one thing that to sort of extend what you were going towards at the end, is when I first heard the title of the talk, From Protest to Policy, I think it's important as you begin to say that we recognize that they share a symbiotic relationship, that they literally feed into each other. So it's not that you start with protesting and then you sort of get sophisticated enough to come up with policies and the protest is left behind. But as you build a community of protest and begin to think about policy, it's always important to continue the protest, because the protest is what creates not just the energy, but it mobilizes more people who will then inform your policies, right? And so I think that's really important. I think in the United States, but perhaps in other places throughout the world, the reality is that white supremacy and capitalism and these other forms of domination are the de facto policies of the land. And so when you're trying to create policies to essentially combat these de facto policies that are really hard to grab, particularly in a post-racial or colorblind, at least that's how the story is being told, society, this pressure oftentimes comes up. What are y'all doing, right? You know, like, what are y'all really doing? We need to know how you're gonna fix this thing called white supremacy. And it's like, well, you know, you can't fix a 400, 500-year problem in 4 to 5 minutes, right? This takes patience, revolutionary patience. That is the time to sit with each other for hours, for meetings weekly, right? This sort of nitty-gritty, unromantic work. And a part of something Derek and I talked about is also like sort of what community forms policy, right? And so you have people who do research for policy. So they're the ones who do the sort of research that allows us to understand the policies that we already have, or even some of the policy initiatives. But that person, I believe, is not enough. It takes a community, right, to decide what kinds of policies are best for. So you need not just researchers, but you also need community organizers. You need folks who just live down the block who's going to be affected by that policy. You need students. You need an entire community of people coming together to ensure that whatever policy it is that you have in the air is going to work for that particular community. So I'm really excited for this conversation, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
The necessity of the community. Great, great. And the next person, Mitchell. Mitchell is size.
Yes, thank you. For a start, I'd like to give a shout out to our special guest, our guests from the UK, Adam Elliott Cooper, Derek, and now from the US, Lucas. Because I think it's very, very special, very important to have this conversation. I agree with you completely now that often when we talk or discuss or think about these issues of white supremacy, racism, we want to change immediately. But it's important to be aware that on the one hand, yes, we need immediate change, but we have to be conscious of the policies that have been in place for over 400 years. We have to be aware that it has been policy that people of African descent, black people, were seen as lesser of human beings or not human beings at all. So it will take a lot of time to change the systems and the structures that we are living in right now. And one of the reasons that we organized this event together with Quincy from Roet at Eten is because I think here in Holland we have reached a certain point in time, especially as an African diaspora, people of African descent, people of color, that we should think about, okay, we have been protesting for a few years now against a particular caricature, black feet. It has created awareness. It has put issues of racism and discrimination on the political agenda. Which has been a taboo for a long time. But what are the steps that we need to make now? How can we move forward? And there are a few people here in this room who I appreciate a lot. For example, people from CLC, Namens Inspraak gegaan. I'm working on a project with them. They asked me to do some research on the Surinamese community here in Holland. And what I did is, over the past few weeks, I've been studying a lot of the research and documents that have been produced and developed by the Dutch government. So I looked at the policy and the politics about how the Dutch government deals with so-called minorities. And when we talk about policy, especially here in Holland, we need to be very cautious and aware of how the political system uses policy, especially the Polder model, to try to co-opt and incorporate us. Because when I look at, I see the anti-black peace movement as a symbol of deeper lying institutional change. I remember quite well, 2-3 years ago I was in Canada for a conference and Quincy was on the show, Paul and Witteman. I saw the reactions on Facebook, it really touched me, and a few weeks later, it was the first time in my life, here in Holland, here in Amsterdam, that I saw so many black people coming together for a common cause at the municipality of Amsterdam. And it really made me think about a quote from one of my favorite revolutionary thinkers, Malcolm X, who said, usually when people are sad, they don't do anything. They just cry over their condition. But when they get angry, that's when they bring about a change. And this anti-black peace movement has finally reached a point where we as people of color, black people in Holland, have reached the point that we said, no, we won't accept this form of racism, this form of oppression anymore. We demand change. And one of the risks that I'm observing right now is that we are forming a risk for the government, and they're trying to make proposals by making changes which seem quite acceptable and like a step forward. You'll think, that's reasonable. It's no blackfacing anymore in that. But what it does is that it takes away the anger, the fire out of the movement, which has been the ignition for this change in our consciousness. So I think we need to be very aware of how smart and subtle the government tries to co-opt our anger and our emotions, which are the catalysts of the change that we need. So this is one point I wanted to make. A second point, which is more a question than a statement, is that I also like to challenge each and every one of us in this space, and I'd like to invite our international guests to think about this, about how we can move beyond the topics that we discuss regularly. We often fight against racism, white supremacy, police brutality, which is very important. But how can we connect it to the issues of fundamental, transformative economic change, of sustainable change? Because I think one of the ways that the system tries to co-opt us and tries to keep us calm and reasonable is by making policy changes, which seem very very nice. On the Field University where I was today, there is a diversity policy, which means there are a few people of color who get some funds and some subsidies to do a few projects. So you think, this is fine, this is progress. But it doesn't really make the transformative and fundamental change which can take away the institutional inequality. Here in Amsterdam, we're organized the Decolonizing the University Conference, but we can pose the question, who are the people that have actually reached the university? Here in Amsterdam, when we compare the different neighborhoods, you'll see that there are schools, which they call black schools, where there are youth, or schools where more than 70% of the youth are sent to the lowest level of education, special education, not even middle school or higher school, but special education, which means they'll never, or have a very small chance to reach the university. So the question I'd like to pose is, how can we, become aware of, the risk of being corrupted by these policy changes which seem like a good solution, but really incorporate us in a broader economical, social, cultural, and political system which reproduces both local, national, and global inequality. And I invite you to think and discuss these issues with us tonight. Thank you.
And now I want to invite Mitchell, Adam, Niall, and Derica to the podium. Okay, so I want to thank you guys for the really fruitful and invigorating ways of jumping into this, because pretty much what I'm hearing is you're all rejecting the premise of the debate. I think that's nice. Right? Right, Derica?
Oh, calm me down.
Yeah.
I'm not rejecting. I'm making it more expensive.
Yeah.
There's a difference.
Yeah. But I like the fact that you started talking about your first foray into organizing was actually like anti-policy. And I'm like, hey, that's a really interesting way to look at the functioning of policy in and of itself. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a bit more about that project?
Oh, sure. So we were, so basically as the organizer for this campaign, it was my responsibility to go around and collect signatures. When you collect enough signatures, you basically say that this many citizens reject this proposal as a ballot initiative. So once we collected the total amount of signatures, it didn't even make it to a ballot, so people didn't vote on it. So in some ways it's anti-democratic, but I'm kind of okay with like it being anti-democratic for like that particular policy. But I think if you look at policy in general, like slavery was a policy, right?
Policy,
exactly.
Yeah.
The ban of interracial marriage was a policy. So we have like these formal policies that have been on the books and we've been protesting for generations. So it's not that we're just moving from protest to policies, from protest to policy reform, because all these broken policies are causing this protest. So that's like one instance. Then there's like the absence of policy, which is what people I think assume we're protesting, since there's not an actual law that says don't kill black people when they're innocent. So like that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So we're trying to figure out, okay, how can we get a policy that speaks to that need without having to have like a bunch of people pass something that says that, which is kind of crazy. Yeah. So there's policy that's already in place, policy that's omitted or absent, and then policy that just needs to be reformed. So there's some policy where we have this expression like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
We have that too.
Okay. So, just because the water's cold, you don't want to like kill your kid. Like you don't want to like get it out. So there's some policies that, okay, that was awkward. So there's some policies that have good pieces in them, but we know that they can improve. So how can we think about all of those three things, and what's the role of protest in all of them?
I think one of the interesting things that you said, Adam, was the criminalization of black life and poverty, and that's embedded in policy in a certain sense. Can you elaborate a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it kind of makes perfect sense, right? If we think about who writes the laws are generally written by wealthy white men, and so therefore we see that the primary role of legislation is generally to protect their property. And so we see that manifested in a number of different ways, which see things like as I mentioned before, begging in Britain, I don't know what the laws are in Holland, but begging in Britain is illegal, right? You have an entire like NGO industrial complex that like harass you by email, telephone, and on the street that constantly beg you. But because they're institutionalised, because they're regulated, all of these things, they're part of like the state mechanism. They're absolutely fine. But if an individual person is homeless and needs some change to like find somewhere warm to sleep, that's illegal, and we'll have to move you on. And so this is quite a fundamental way in which poverty is completely criminalised, and multi-million pound NGOs are considered to be like the pinnacle of like social progress. And so, and we see this pattern reproduced continually.
Yeah.
And I think this really kind of exposes the kind of fundamental contradictions and the fundamental injustice within our so-called justice systems, which make it, I think, very difficult for us to solve them through policy reform. And they ask more kind of quite fundamental questions about the nature of crime and law and justice.
Yeah. Mitchell, you talk about anger. You talk about our anger, or if I can include myself, our anger to change policy, but there's also anger against changing policy. The fundamental changes that Adam is talking about, how is that going to happen when the people in power are angry and don't want to let go?
Good question. I think that what we've seen over the course of history and also in recent history is that the anger, especially from the bottom up, from the grassroots, is able to create disruptions within the system of the people in power, usually the wealthy, white, heterosexual men. So I think that this disruption of the social, cultural, especially economic system can create the power, the level of the grassroots people of the community, which can create space to demand more transformative and fundamental change. Because if you don't use that disruptive form of protest and just stand outside with a banner or a poster, please can you help to change some policies, I don't like this. Or you can write a report. There have been thousands of reports. Okay, I'm exaggerating, but there have been a lot of reports
100
about racism in Holland, about discrimination, about inequality in different field areas of society. I had to study them. I've read reports of the 60s and 70s which say exactly the same as the reports that have been written 1 or 2 years ago. Which means that certain forms of protest and certain forms of trying to put things on the agenda don't work. And movements such as Black Lives Matter and what I've seen also in the UK have made me aware about the necessity of disruptive social change, disruptive protest.
When we talk about disruptive social change, Niall, you mentioned the post-racial society. You could say that the post-racial society, or the idea that society is not post-racial, is disruptive in of itself, right? I think a lot of people who would be looking at the 1950s and now looking today would be saying, hey, we've changed it. What do you say to those people?
Yeah, so I think this is interesting, the idea of the narrative or the story that's told about the United States, particularly post-President Obama, being one that says, well, you used to be in chains, and now you have a black person in the White House, so racism is over, right? And so I think that story is very disruptive, particularly for this grassroots kind of, the need for grassroots movements to rise up at a moment where since the 60s, black folks haven't gotten any economic empowerment. Since the 60s, black folks in many ways are, in certain kinds of ways, are worse off. We used to have factory jobs because of neoliberalism. The factory jobs are gone. They've been shipped over either to prisons or to other parts of the world. And so I think this question of policy in an Obama era is imperative. And one of the reasons is because one of the things I said earlier to someone is President Obama is a master rhetorician. Right? He has a way of speaking to particular crowds especially black communities, black churches, and other black communities in a way that makes us feel good. Like he sounds like our uncle, you know what I mean? So it's like, oh man, he cracks a joke. You're like, cracking up. You're like, man, this is the president. I just can't believe. And has a way of, and this is not I hope this is not coming off as a cynical reading. I'm just trying to point out a phenomena that I think we could all see.
It's recognition. We're
right. And so what his rhetoric does, what his storytelling does, and how familiar he sounds, it can cause a sort of hypnosis, a political hypnosis, where we don't even think about what policies his administration is actually passing. So it's just good enough that the brother's in the White House, and we're not being critical enough, I think, of the actual policies that are in place. I mean, since he's been in office, there has been a lot of critique. I think as people begin to wake up and the sleepwalking has begun to wear off, and the same young people who came out to vote in droves for President Obama, I think are starting to say, well, damn, I mean, black young people like myself are still being killed in the street. I still can't get a job. When I get sick, I still don't have, proper health care. The hospital that used to exist here is no longer here, so I have to go to the suburbs to go to the hospital. So the conditions are still the same, though I see a new face that looks like mine in the White House. What the hell is going on? And I think that's when we see the rising up and the protests happening. So I think your question is important. We have to pay attention, not just to rhetoric. And this is coming from a preacher from a black church, right? We have to pay attention to the substance of what people are telling.
Yeah. When we look at the substance of what people are telling and doing, when we look at the recent nomination of Jeremy Corbyn to the Labour Party, what does that do for fundamental changes?
It's certainly a disruption. So people who aren't familiar, Jeremy Corbyn is a socialist-leaning member of the Labour Party who's always had a relatively low profile. He's always been in favour of quite anti-imperialist policies. He protested against apartheid in South Africa. He's always been an advocate for the rights of the Palestinian liberation movement, and he's always been really, really good for a lot of the black struggles in Britain as well, and been very, very supportive of them. And he's generally quite a socialist-oriented person. And he recently won the bid to be head of the British Labour Party, one of Britain's two major parties. He's been hounded in the press in enormous amounts. A very senior general in the British Army wrote in the Sunday Times that if Jeremy Corbyn does become Prime Minister, that he would consider a military coup. And he basically said you can't have any old maverick running the country. He said, because Jeremy Corbyn said he wanted to leave NATO. He said he wanted to get rid of Britain's nuclear weapons programme, and the British Army said we're not having that. And we will have to take control of this country. And this was written in the Sunday Times, the quality press. And so, although Jeremy Corbyn has been very disruptive in his rise to the leadership of the British Labour Party, and I think he's definitely shifted the remit of discussion from, shall we neoliberalise a little bit or loads, to actually neoliberalism is actually really messed up. Look at the following things it does. Maybe we should nationalise. Maybe it should be the role of the government to create employment rather than hoping the private sector does it. Maybe instead of wondering where to bomb in Syria, how about we just don't bomb Syria?
Exactly.
So these are quite fundamental shifts in the remit of discussion, which is really, really important and hugely disruptive. However, I think that it's unlikely that his own party will let him last until the next election. I think it's unlikely the press will let him last until the next election. And I think it's unlikely the British Army will let him last until the next election. And so unfortunately, although he does pose an enormous threat to the British establishment and has mobilised a huge amount of people in rethinking the ways in which our foreign policy or our economic policy or social policy is structured, I don't think it will be him who is able to lead us forward to progressive change in the future, unfortunately, due to the nature of the system in which we're going.
When we look at the Netherlands, for example, right now we have a couple of people who are swinging a banner saying, here, we're leftists and we're going for it. What do you think about that? The way how politics is dealing with the de facto white supremacist society?
I think there are a lot of similarities between the friend from the UK, Adam just said. In Holland, we for a long time have been presented with a political climate where people used to say there's the extreme right. You have the PVV, it used to be Anmat. You have the neoliberal party, the VVD, and the Labour Party, which used to be left and uses a leftist rhetoric about being there for ordinary people. Whilst when you look at their policies of the past years, or actually the past decades, it's the same as what Adam just said. You have a neoliberal party and a slightly less neoliberal party. And I think we definitely need to have a change in discourse, a change in thinking, where we challenge this dominant neoliberal way of thinking. And unfortunately, I have not seen or identified the person who has been able to put this on the political agenda yet here in Holland.
When we look at the way how politics need their voters, the pushback and the back and forth. Derek, you talked about it having to be, you have to have this back and forth between the protesters and the people in power. Recently there was a video of Hillary Clinton talking to two people from the Black Lives Matter movement. When you saw that, what did you think?
That's a good question. So I actually didn't watch the video. I had a conversation with someone who's in the video, so I didn't watch the video, and I'm not actually comfortable revealing the content of that conversation. So feel free to ask me another question. I know this is what I do know. I know that video wasn't supposed to be public.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think the video was secretly recorded. Actually, I'm lying because now I'm recalling what Hillary Clinton said. I think I'm recalling what Hillary Clinton was saying, something along the lines of the way you need to win people over to bring them to the, okay, so maybe I did. I've seen a lot of videos. There's a lot going on. So what did I think? Okay, let me think about this. So I think, and this is from that video, what do you want, what are the demands, all this other stuff. So those conversations are happening. So Hillary Clinton is meeting with people who, I don't want to call them representatives of the Black Lives Matter movement, but they're definitely participants in the Black Lives Matter movement. They're definitely activists to a certain degree. I find those conversations really, really to be interesting because politicians know that this movement has demanded so much in terms of meeting demands that now politicians who are running for office, I would say the Democratic Party, I'm comfortable saying the Republican Party has not responded with how do you want us to inform our agenda. But now we do see Democratic candidates such as Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton looking for people to talk to inform some sort of racial justice agenda that will ultimately inform the platform that they're going to run on. So after Bernie Sanders was called out on Twitter, like 3 days later, we have an entire new webpage on his site. It's like racial justice agenda, police brutality is like the top thing on the line. So I think one, thinking about the way that social media is now, like people with certain power, if you got 10 followers on Twitter, you're probably not getting Hillary Clinton's attention, just to be honest. If you have an egg as your avatar, you're probably not getting Bernie Sanders. But there are certain people who are a part of this movement who are able to call on people who are running for office. I don't know if that's truly democratic either. But because these conversations are happening, we now see at least an attempt to respond to some demands that are coming from different people. Now, back to what I was saying at the podium, it's important that we think about the social science that influence the strength of those demands, the impact of that policy. It's not good enough that Bernie Sanders has, police brutality or the way that we train cops as a part of his agenda and platform, we also need to think, okay, what states are already doing that? What cities are doing that? What countries are doing that? Is it working? Is it not working? Instead of assuming that slapping a camera on a police officer is going to radically erase, police brutality. So even though that these conversations are happening more and more often, and they're happening publicly, they're happening in private, and they're being leaked publicly, they're happening in all sorts of ways, it's still important that we don't think that those things are successful, because they still have to be implemented. And after they're implemented, they have to be reevaluated and then reformed. Like, policy is not enough. There's a process in which we create effective policy. And yeah.
Great answer.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I practice.
One of the things that's interesting as well is that the notion of young people, and it's young people at the forefront once again, and at the same time also informed by the older generations. Mitchell, you talked about working together with the Surinaamse Inspraakprogram. Can you tell a bit more about that? How does that function? How does that work?
Well, a few of the representatives are here. I don't know if does everybody know the Surinaamse Inspraakprogram?
No, they don't.
Okay. And I think it's a very interesting form of organizing here in Holland. So in the 60s, 70s, you had a large amount of people from the former colonies, Suriname, Curaçao, also from Turkey and Morocco, as guest laborers coming in. And the government at first thought most of them would move back to their respective countries. After a few years they realized, okay, these people are here to stay, what should we do with them? Because up until then this was a very white country. And what they did in that period was that they developed a policy, on the top of my head it's called the minderhedenbeleid, the minority policy, where they, the rationale behind it was, okay, let's give them their own space, let's give them some subsidy, let them remain in their own spaces, build their own institutions, etc., etc. And we'll allow that, we'll tolerate that. That's what Holland is known for, their tolerance. If they don't get too much influence, power on our way of dealing with the world. And I have a kind of ambiguous position on these kinds of organizations, because the CO is one of the organizations that were invented by the government as representatives for the Surinamese community, and you have for each large minority community a organization such as that. And I think in a certain way it was a form of what I just said in my presentation, of co-opting these minorities. Because what happened in the 70s is that in the UK there were the Brixton riots, and a lot of black people were standing up for themselves, and it caused a lot of disruption. And in Holland it literally says it in the policy documents. They were scared that the things that happened in London would happen here in Amsterdam and Holland as well. So they developed a policy to prevent minorities and black people from rising up as well, by subsidizing them, giving them money, giving them their own organizations, which could should be act as the representatives of the communities. But as you can see, if you look at the figures in terms of racism, representatives from the different communities in politics, in positions of power, in economics, in education, it has not created equality and equal representation in these different areas of life. So I'm not sure if I answered your question.
How is it working with them? Because now you've explained what organizations are. How do you work with them now? Because you're the younger generation. You're standing at protests.
Yeah.
You're shouting at the mayor. I mean, figuratively speaking.
Yeah.
So how is that working with older generations who you say were kind of co-opted?
Well, what we do now is that we try to build a relationship. They have direct connections with the government, the Ministry of Social Affairs, etc. And we try to, I'm doing research to critically reflect on the position of Surinamese people in Holland. And the intention is to develop recommendations for policy change which can have a sustainable and meaningful impact on the Surinamese community, which can benefit both young and old in Holland.
Guys, well, thank you for this first block. We're going to take a quick break, and then after the break, you guys can jump in and ask questions and just give yeah. Cool? Okay. Give them another round of applause.